In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So I have a high-tech prop for today. Hopefully you'll recognize this. It's called a box. As someone who has moved many times and packed and shipped many gifts, I can tell you that these boxes can be really useful things. In the case of moving, they help us to organize, categorize, and prioritize all the things around us. What's it like being in a box? Well, the way I've worked with boxes, the contents of a box get two experiences. The first is they get labeled. They're defined in a simple and concise manner. Utensils, lampshades, shoes, and then toward the end of the move, those 8 other boxes that just say stuff. And then the boxes get closed up, right? So that everything inside stays inside and everything outside stays out. A good sealed and taped box won't even let a ray of sunlight inside the box. Sometimes, though, we end up in boxes. Now, as a disclaimer, this never happened to me moving or packing a gift. I'm talking more about the inside world, right? Sometimes we put other people in boxes, too. Sometimes we experience being labeled and closed down by others. Not smart enough. Bad apple. Weirdo. Or sometimes we do this to ourselves, right? I'm not spiritual. Or I'm not good at math. Or some things that we're almost afraid to really verbalize, but we feel them, right? Like, I'm permanently broken. I'm a sad person. I always feel afraid. And these boxes with their labels, these kinds of boxes also keep their contents sealed up and safe from the sunlight of the Spirit. But the thing is, people don't belong in boxes because people aren't things. We don't exist for a purpose of doing. We don't exist to fulfill the expectations of others. And that's what our gospel today is actually all about. Now, at first blush, you might think this is one of those weird stories where Jesus is just being unfair. Right? He kind of comes down on Martha. Oh, Martha, Martha, you're worried and distracted by many things. Well, thanks a lot, Jesus. You didn't seem to mind those things when you were sitting down eating the food I cooked. You didn't seem to mind when I picked up your plate and took it to the kitchen and pretended like you were going to help. And I said, no, it's okay, I got it. So, you're welcome. Mary and Martha were two powerful first-century women, at least by first-century standards. And there's a traditional interpretation that runs like this. Mary and Martha were running this house, which was odd in those days that it did not belong to a male. Right? So they were the decision makers, it seems, in this house. And Mary is the contemplative, the mystical one, the one who prays, the one who sits at the feet of the Master. And Martha is the person of action. And we might have been erroneously told that what this gospel is about is Jesus saying one of these is better than the other. That Jesus is preferring the contemplative Mary to the active Martha. It's a very neat way to put each of these characters into their own boxes and to try to make sense of this story. The only problem is it doesn't make any sense because the Gospel of Luke does not in any way prejudice the inner or mystical or contemplative life over the life of action. In fact, Jesus' own mission, as he defines it in the Gospel of Luke, is pretty darn active. Here's what he says. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Sounds pretty active to me. So how do we interpret this story? What is the better part that Mary is being commended for taking? And what does any of this have to do with boxes? Sociologists who study the first century write about these things, and the title of one article I've read kind of says it all. It's called this: Legitimizing a Woman Taking a Male Role. Jesus commends Mary for taking on the role of a man. You see, in the first century, only males were allowed to sit at the foot of a teacher and given the leisure time to learn the law. Only males could be disciples of the law and expand in that way their spiritual life. This was not part of the box that a woman was meant to be in. It was only part of the box that a male could be in. So what Jesus is doing is he's giving an okay to Mary stepping out of her box. Society put Mary in a box, and Jesus commends her for clawing her way out of it. Where the world labeled her a servant, Jesus calls her a disciple. Where the world labeled her a woman, Jesus calls her a person. The better part that Mary chooses is simply this: to see herself the way God sees her. And that seeing gives her the courage to climb out of that box, to step outside, and to seek something more than the roles she was given to fulfill. Mary's decision made her a bad first century sister. And it made her a bad first century woman. But it made her a really good disciple of Jesus. Because you see, part of the good news of early Christianity was that it invited people to step out of boxes. The early Eucharist, as formal as it may be in some parts of the Christian world, initially it was considered taboo because all sorts of social taboos were being broken. People who were totally not supposed to eat in the presence of each other were breaking bread together. All kinds of social boundaries were being violated. That is the root history. That is the genius of what we do at this table. In fact, early Christianity was criticized by Roman pagans as a religion of women and slaves because of its radical acceptance and practices of equality. But how about us? How do we know if we're in a box? It's a kind of complicated question, really. Because on the one hand, not everything about me is the box. Right? I can make a mistake and think that all the roles I'm given in my life are keeping me down, and I'm meant to fly out of any definition of myself and kind of expand into a sphere where all things are possible, unbound by time and space and culture and language and nationality and religion and relationships. And that's kind of called idolatry, because that's me becoming God, isn't it? And it's just darn silly. Because time, space, culture, language, nationality, religion, and relationships are the key components that make us who we are, where we are. They're our lifelines into reality. As one poet said, emancipation from the soil is no freedom for the tree. In our Christian tradition, we're not meant to become disembodied, non-temporal spirits with no roles in life. We're meant to be human persons that exist in time and space, developing within a particular culture and language group. Much of how we develop is not even of our own choosing, and that's okay too. But on the other hand, sometimes we may actually find ourselves in boxes. And sometimes our boxes can be so comfy and so roomy and so familiar that we don't think they're boxes at all. Abraham and Sarah, in our first reading, were in a box. Right? Our reading ended, if you paid attention, with the angel saying, "Your wife Sarah shall conceive a son." You know what happens in the next line? Sarah laughs at him. She's like, "Look, according to this book, I'm 90-something, and maybe you haven't read biology in a while, but it's not how it works." She had a box as to how things worked. God had different ideas. So how do we know if we're in a box? We can follow Mary's example. If a role that we have in our life is constraining us from the deep desire of our spirit, it might be a box. If a role we take on is creating suffering in us and diminishing our joy, it's probably a box. And if some role or responsibility seems truly inauthentic to whom we believe God calls us to be, it's likely a box. Some of these boxes are of our own making, patterns of resentment or self-pity or escaping from anxiety that leave us feeling less joyful and less at home with God, ourselves, and one another. But today, Jesus affirms to us that God didn't make us to fill roles or fulfill expectations. God didn't make us to be products that get boxed up and labeled by our merchandising and depersonalizing world. God made us to love. God made us to be channels of love in the world. God made us to sit at the feet of Jesus, lost in love, and to hear there what roles we might take on and fulfill. So how do we get there? There's no easy, soft way. Like Mary, if we step out of our boxes, we might anger and disappoint and scare other people. Oh well. Getting out of a box does take courage. And the virtue of courage, in my experience, grows when we draw on and cultivate two things: power and imagination. We have a lot of power at our disposal. There's power present in our liturgies when we gather together. There's power that goes back to the practices of the early church, to the temple in Jerusalem, and even before that, to the high places and holy wells that the ancestors of the Israelites worshipped on, where their ancestors lived and died and had experiences of God. There's power present in 2,000 years of Christian wisdom and spiritual searching and finding. There's power present in the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ that shows up at our very table every time we gather. Participating in the sacramental life and wisdom traditions of the church can fill us with power. Then there's imagination. One of the things that can happen in prayer is that our imaginations get stirred. We might imagine what it would be to have more options in our life or in our self-definition than we or others have ever held for ourselves. We might imagine what God's imagination says about us. We might gain the imagination to visualize that better self, that better world that our hearts know is possible, and to fall in love with that vision as if we were staring into the eyes of Christ himself. Then we can act in courage. And if we do, like Mary, we will find that we will be met by the divine presence sitting right next to wherever we are. Today, we're reminded that the gospel is an out-of-the-box reality. When it comes to boxes, Jesus breaks them. Jesus is the breaker of boxes. I didn't hit you, did I? Yes, you did. I did? Jesus wouldn't have done that. I'm going to try it again. Jesus is the breaker of boxes. Jesus is the liberator of lives. And he calls us today and every day not to drudgery, not to fulfill expectations, not to complete some task list, but to courage, adventure, and love. Will we choose the safe way, the boxed up way, and be distracted by many things? Or will we, like Mary, let ourselves be empowered by Christ and choose that better part that God imagines for each of us?